But Lisa, Katie's going to give your introduction, and I'm going to sit down. But if you have anything you need me to do, or they have your handouts already, so just holler at me.
Great. I want to thank Lisa for joining us, and thank all of you for being here too, as our real life people. We're just the pretend people. No, just kidding. This has been so fun to see how technology has been able to enhance the way we've been able to learn. And one of the things I'm really excited about is that we're having Lisa Kimball, Dr. Lisa Kimball, as our guest today. She's a professor at Virginia Theological Seminary. She's actually, I just learned, the Associate Dean of Lifelong Learning, which totally makes sense. She does great work, and her research in the past has been on godparents in religious communities. And even she's been on the steering committee for our project, but watching her work and the way she chose somebody, a graduate student, to work with, and the way she's mentored her along the way, she really lives out kind of the mentoring role that she is teaching about. So that's been really fun for me to learn from her, just in watching the way she cultivates relationships. So without further ado, I offer to you, Lisa, Dr. Lisa Kimball, and I'm really looking forward to learning from you too, Lisa, today. So thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Katie. And thanks, Rick. Hello, everybody. It's always so odd to be sitting in my little sort of outer office and know that you're all in a classroom together. And I'm wearing my voting button. I hope those of you who could vote today did or will. So I thought maybe it would be helpful to just give you a kind of a beginning framework about why I care so much about mentoring. It kind of, like anything, we have our own story. And then I'd love to hear just a little bit from you, samples perhaps from the classroom, about where your lives and mentoring have intersected formally in terms of other organizations and or in the church, and maybe perhaps I take a show of hands of people that were involved in confirmation programs with mentoring. But so it's fun to hold the space in your class for this subject, because it's a big one. And I think my personal piece of this is I grew up, in the Episcopal Church and had terrible, terrible, terrible formation. God has a great sense of humor that I've ended up doing what I'm doing, because nothing about the books or the understandings we have about how faith is formed and passed on really happened in my life, except that there were these mentors, these people who came into my life at unexpected times and witnessed to me in really powerful ways that the love of God was greater than whatever it was that was distracting me or frightening me or kind of causing my life to be other than hopeful. And those are the people that I look back to and I remember with great fondness, even though I went to church, all of my life with wonderful parents who did actually much more than I'm giving them credit for, but we were in terms of faith formation, but we never talked about our faith. We were a good Episcopal family. You don't really talk about Jesus. You just do what you do, So it took a long time to realize where my faith had come from and how many people had come along the margins of my life and been there as hope carriers and hope builders. And then in the formal sense, I was a youth minister for many years. I led confirmation programs in congregations with a lot of the questions that this research project has really been looking at. What really works and why, and how do you get young people who are reluctant to be involved long enough at least to make a choice for themselves? And how do you support the parents who want their kids involved to be sort of gentle on their kids and the support that they give them be constructive? And that led me into graduate school. I ended up getting my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and it's in education, and it's in the non-formal, informal dimensions of education. And so I worked my way through graduate school, working at the Center for 4-H Youth Development and doing research at the Institute for Child Development. And both of those organizations do a lot of work with mentoring, youth mentoring in communities, resilience work with young people, and the relationship between mentors and resilience. And then as Katie said, I ended up writing my dissertation on the significance of godparents, baptismal sponsors, as sort of carriers of healthy youth development in our time, and what can that look like? So there was a lot of mentoring literature in there too. But I do think that the dimension of mentoring it can be romanticized, and one of the things I want to talk about a little bit today is that my question for confirmation programs and for the church more generally about mentoring is, are we really doing mentoring well? Are we paying attention to the opportunities for those significant relationships to form? Or are we calling it mentoring and it really is something else? Because I think in our confirmation research, we've seen a little bit of both. We've seen some very technical mentoring programs that probably don't have the transformational impact that my personal stories of mentors certainly did. And I hope some of the reading that you did for this kind of stirred in you. So that's my sort of circuitous but deeply committed connection to mentoring. And we'll talk more about the specifics in confirmation in a little bit. But just a show of hands, how many of you have been involved in any kind of intentional mentoring program at some point in your own youth or in your adulthood? A few of you. And how many of you have been involved in a confirmation program that had some kind of mentoring piece to it, either as a young confirmand getting ready for confirmation yourself, or perhaps an adult who was volunteering in that role? So you're familiar with congregations who've been doing some of that work. So Brian, if you can start the slides, it would be great. We'll get to a quote here. I am completely happy to be interrupted, by the way. So yell, shout. If I can't see you at the moment, just be sure to tell me something that is, just if you have a question or you want to talk about something I'm not talking about, just say so. So that quote there, this is a quote from a confirmand, the top one. And it's a quote that really does suggest how ripe young people are for mentoring. It's the young person anticipating, in this case it's a boy, he's anticipating what confirmation can be and really wanting it to be something that will be significant in his life. So sorry, I can't, because the slides are coming up very small on my side. Katie, you were right.
If you click on it, it'll become big on your.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to do. There we go.
I've done that on this end so we can see them.
No, it's great. Okay, perfect. So anyway, so this young person is sort of on the front end of confirmation. Nothing explicit about mentoring yet, but sort of looking at the possibility that, there's going to be more than just going to classes and getting confirmed. It's really the start of making the religion at the center of your life, really having something that makes a difference. And we picked this Philippians quote here. By the way, some of these slides and some of this thinking I've shared with my graduate student. So Kate Ciberini wrote her MDiv thesis on mentoring in confirmation. And so she and I have done this work together. So I give her lots of credit for what we're doing. So this is the notion that if we are going to form the faith of young people and have this unique opportunity, which I sometimes call this time of intensification of faith in confirmation, then mentoring can be a really significant part of that experience, but also and especially if it continues beyond the actual programmatic length of the preparation. So if we can do the next slide. This is from the survey that we did for the project, and I'm sure you've been talking some about this in your class. This is just one of the options in a question that listed what are the different teaching methods that you, the adult leader of a confirmation program in your congregation, use. And what's interesting, if you look across this, the average across the 5 denominations that participated is 57% of the congregations that responded to the survey say that they use mentoring in their confirmation program. And it's fairly even across our traditions, more so than other teaching methods actually that we use. What's interesting about this, I think, is that when we look at other methods that are used, this is kind of highly ranked. So the only ones that come in significantly above this, there are many right around this level, but one is reading the Bible and studying the Bible. That came in at like 76%, appropriately enough. Group discussions, I'm glad to say, came in at 96%. Woohoo. I know, woohoo, right? Some experiential stuff going on in some of these classes. This is good. But hands-on learning and service, which are often associated with confirmation programs, came in just above this at 64%. So mentoring is not an afterthought in many of these programs. It really is something that our churches are doing. And again, as I said earlier, my question is, how well are we doing it? Do we know what it is that we're really doing? So next slide, please. What is a mentor? As you read, I think, in the Sellner book, there's a lot of terminology that can be associated with similar practices to mentoring. So shout out some of them. What are some of the other names that are given to people who are doing things like mentors do? Can any of you think of some of them? So I know you're alive.
Sponsors.
Sponsors, witness, yep. A few more?
Apprentice.
Apprentice is a good one. He talks about that in the book. So the old apprenticeship model of learning and teaching. Counselor, maybe, advocate. He talks about the soul friend idea. The notion of host, some people use that, or guide. Protege sometimes comes up in some of the mentoring literature. Certainly teacher, advisor. So there's a whole collection, there's a Wittgensteinian collection of sort of family of resemblance of roles in our society that we recognize have dimensions that overlap with what we've come to understand as mentoring. And mentoring has historically been primarily a social mechanism through which young people were supported in their transition into adulthood. So it was always adults with young people. And in the past, and within sort of many, many cultural systems, mentors have been non-parent relatives, aunties, uncles, grandparents, older siblings, people who could guarantee, as the language of guarantor, could guarantee that young people would thrive beyond the transitions of adolescence, beyond the transitions of childhood into independent living as an adult. But as you all know, the changes in our social patterns with fractured and stressed familial bonds, with teachers not necessarily being family members within proximity, other formal roles of mentoring have become very important. And we've begun to see the benefit done well of the social capital that can be established when teachers, coaches, Boy Scout leaders, choir leaders, pastors, good intentional neighbors begin to enter into the lives of young people and help them with that incredibly important transition. So when we are not living near each other, we need these opportunities for sort of these extended families of choice or of alternative substance. And rather than kinship structures, we end up with these formalized systems like Big Brothers and Big Sisters, Boys and Girls Club. And there's a lot good in those programs. There's a lot that they do very, very well. But they are a form of mentoring, we're going to talk about in a moment, that is often called formal mentoring. They're negotiated. There's a contractual agreement. There's a period of time. And the church lives in a somewhat fuzzier area that we'll talk about as natural mentoring. And confirmation may be one of those times when natural mentoring and formal mentoring intersect more fully. But what's really important is that this rhythm of spiritual mentoring, this beginning to walk with people as they are journeying in faith, is ancient, right? You've probably heard of the catechumenate, the earliest form of raising up adults and preparing them for baptism in the church. They had a baptismal sponsor that we now call godparents in many traditions. Those sponsors were their mentors. They were those elders in faith who walked with them and companioned them. So as we talk about mentoring in the church and in confirmation, we're beginning to think about sort of reclaiming some of those traditions, but also connecting them to some of our contemporary understandings about how important it is for young people to grow up with healthy role models, with examples that assure them of their value and worth, their beauty, their imago Dei, the wondrous creation that they are as a child of God. So if we could have the next slide. This is one definition of mentor that I really like from the traditional mentoring literature. It says, first, the mentor is someone with greater experience or wisdom than the mentee. Second, the mentor offers guidance or instruction that is intended to facilitate the growth and development of the mentee. And third, there is an emotional bond between mentor and mentee, a hallmark of which is a sense of trust. So keep those in the back of your mind and think about those churches that you know where confirmation includes mentoring, because you may already see that there often are some gaps in what we're trying to do. I certainly know a lot of well-meaning and loving adults who have been asked to be mentors for young people in confirmation, and they say yes gladly. They care about the young people, they love their church, they love God, but they might not actually feel that they have greater experience or wisdom in Christianity than the young person they're mentoring. So we immediately are kind of creating this tension, this paradox, that we have healthy adults whose faith lives may not be as mature and as fully flourishing as the ideal spiritual mentor might need them to be. And yet they're in a healthy relationship with the young person, trying to model ways and practices of our Christian tradition. Excuse me. So what then is a spiritual mentor? So we can go to the next slide. This is a reminder that Jesus modeled the kind of mentoring that we are aiming for. This is, of course, the passage in Luke where, the lawyer stands up and asks Jesus, teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And he goes on to talk about, well, what's written in the law? And we go on into the story of the Good Samaritan. And then he leads, towards the end, and he talks about, that finally at the very end, he says, then the one who showed him mercy is the person who truly understands what it means to be, what it really means to be a person following God and being faithful. And Jesus says so simply, well, then go and do likewise. In Sellner's work, his explorations of the Christian spiritual mentoring that you read cite the scriptural tradition that includes God as a feminine wisdom figure. And I find that very valuable, who, as he quotes, in each generation passes into holy souls, making them friends of God and prophets, as well as providing comfort in cares and sorrows and acting as teacher and guide. So we draw on our spiritual tradition, we draw on our sacred texts, we draw on the practices of the people of God centuries before us when we begin to think about spiritual mentoring in the contemporary cultures in which we live. He goes on and says that in Isaiah in 53, we hear of God's self-emptying and willingness to heal us through his wounds. And in Isaiah 61, of God bringing good news and binding up broken hearts. These are practices, right, of people of faith modeling something for others that are indeed hopeful, indeed transformative. So throughout Scripture, we encounter this caring God who is our friend, a teacher, a comforter, and always a guide. And this God becomes incarnate in the life of Jesus. So Jesus then taught his disciples that it was their whole lives, their embodied witness, that must be their teaching to the world, and that they would be known as his followers by their own willingness to follow his example. And you know this, right? To share all that they are and who they are with each other and with the world around them. So then we get to Sellner's definition of mentoring. And he says spiritual mentoring is this age-old Christian tradition, a calling and a gift more common than perhaps previously thought. It depends more on mutuality, reciprocity, and friendship than direction given from the top down, or a relationship with someone who supposedly has all the answers, while the other is only a passive recipient of such wisdom. So this begins to open the space for those adults I was mentioning, those people who are genuinely committed to their spiritual journey, may not know a lot about what they believe, may not have an incredible facility with Scripture, but they sincerely are showing up. They're showing up to be in relationship with young people in a way that is confident and sturdy. Next slide, please. So this is where we get into the formal versus natural mentoring. It's pretty straightforward, but it is important for us to understand the distinction, because when you look and read the literature, or even just in the news about mentoring programs, they tend to be describing formal mentoring programs. And in our cases, the church size and the culture that we come from, and where we are trying to enact or practice confirmation with young people, may actually determine for us whether natural mentoring that is already provided by that organic intergenerational community that is a small church is in fact ample for the confirmation support that we need, in fact ideal. Or is a church larger and more programmatic, and in fact then entering into a more negotiated formal mentoring program is in fact essential and important. There's a lot of research that shows that young people naturally seek out mentors. They have a sort of moral compass that is looking for healthy adults, and that healthy adults are then characterized by people who can provide the emotional and psychological support and the encouragement for everything, including the spirit of those young people. So those natural mentors, those people kids find, those people they're drawn to, are often already a part of their kinship structure that I mentioned before, and they're distinct from the programmatic people who they might meet at an organized club activity. Small congregations, which I love more than I can tell you, when they are healthy, know how to do this instinctively. Small churches need young people to be fully involved. I was very much part of supporting a small congregation in Minnesota when I worked there. And, one young person had a key to the church because he would stop there on the way to pass the church every morning on the way to school, heat up the snowblower and blow the snow off the sidewalks so that the older members of the congregation could get into the building later on in the day. Another teenager in that same church played the organ because they no longer had an organist. They had young people in every level of decision making in the church. That church didn't need a formal mentoring program in its confirmation program. What they needed were spaces for those elders to sit down with those young people and tell their stories of faith. And for the young people to be able to ask those deeper questions that might not get asked when you're blowing the snow. But that chance to sit over coffee or have, something to eat together and share a deeper informal understanding of what it is that God is doing in your life. So in our research, we have found there's a church here in Virginia that we visited, an Episcopal church that is a small church. And the pastor there, the rector, as we call the senior pastor, said, this is such a small community that it would be really easy, I think, to overstructure things. It doesn't need to be that complicated. Basically, all of these kids are interacting with adults in this church all of the time. Their real formation happens just in the informal structures, not in the programs. Whereas other congregations with less of an emphasis on intergenerational ministry or that bigger program-sized church will really benefit from the structure. So my goal for us today is to think about how can we as leaders in congregations and in any kind of youth ministry program that facilitates mentoring, be really, really clear about our expectations, both of the young people and of the adults, so that we know what kind of mentoring we're supporting, we're nurturing. The next slide is going to show us sort of what distinguishes formal mentoring from natural mentoring. This is some older research, but it's still very, very sound, and I come back to it often. The idea here is that the degree of external control, so formal mentoring has a lot more external control, right? Somebody's in charge, someone establishes the program. The degree of planning and institutionalization. Formal mentoring has a structure, it has a delivery system, it has a timeline. The level of intentionality. Formal mentoring is more intentional in that people are more self-conscious about the fact that they are mentoring or being mentored. Natural mentoring is so much more organic that you don't sort of recognize that you're being as intentional. When you slow people down and you ask some of these wise elders in congregations how they live their life in the church, they just sort of take for granted that they notice young people. They take for granted that they know their names. They take for granted that they value who they are and that they're curious about their daily lives. Those are natural spiritual practices in a healthy Christian community, but that's a kind of intentionality that we have to cultivate among younger generations. So another distinguishing factor is nature of the goals of the actual program. So what is it you're trying to do with mentoring? Are they organizational goals? Are you trying to accomplish something for the sake of the organization? That happens in business settings often. Or are they individual goals? Is it as they are in confirmation programs? Are we hoping that the young person's experience of faith will grow? Their understanding of mature life in Christ as an adult in the church will grow. Another distinction is where decisions are made about the goals of the program. So a formal program has somebody or some group of people who have determined that they will design and implement a mentoring program. So management teams in businesses do this. They mentor younger employees, and they have a purpose for that. They want the younger employees' performance to improve. They want them to be oriented to the corporation and the corporation's values and goals, and they want whatever the bottom line is to grow, right? But if you think about small congregations, our mentoring, again, is so organic that we may not actually sit down and think about what are the actual goals that we have in relationship to the young people with whom we share our life in Christ and our community life at church. But when we begin to be intentional in a confirmation program, we're beginning to move from the just purely natural mentoring into something that is more formal. So the question about what it says here, the depth of the dyadic relationship, how deep does the friendship relationship go? How formative is it? Depth happens over time, but depth also happens because of the way the two people interact. So formal mentoring often has expectations that are very specific. They can create a fairly surface relationship between two people, check the box, done our duty, or they can create a profound experience. If the challenge that is put to two people is to build something that is really challenging, and they have to actually engage each other's capacities at the edge of their knowing for a period of time, they may well build a bond that will last well beyond the formal relationship. Another place that distinguishes the two.
Can I interrupt with a question?
Please,
I'm behind the camera, but it's Cato. You know, as leaders in the church, we're responsible to our congregations to kind of report our results. And so when it comes to mentoring, how would you say we measure the success of our mentoring?
Right. That's a great question. I think part of it is knowing what kind of mentoring you're trying to do, first of all, right? So one of the things I want to get to in a little bit is show these two examples I just pulled from two congregations that had confirmation mentoring, and how realistic they are and how healthy they are to accomplish some of the goals that we understand really good mentoring can achieve. I think the challenge with measurement is the church is famous for this, right? That we just go on about doing things, and we don't really know what it is we're trying to accomplish. So how can we know if we accomplished it? We do this even in traditional Christian education, right? We just pick curriculum and we put kids in classrooms at certain ages for Sunday school, and we hope that they're going to learn something, but we very rarely know what it is we hope they'll learn by when, or what we hope they'll behave or practice. And so we don't know how to assess it. And we only have things like attendance and, you know, do they like it? And are they enthusiastic? Do they answer questions? So in terms of the kinds of things with mentoring, there are definitely ways to assess the health of a mentoring program, but you definitely want to know who is involved and to what end have they agreed to be involved in the mentoring piece of that. It's much harder to assess natural mentoring than it is to assess formal mentoring, because it's open-ended, right? It's ongoing. But even that can be assessed. If you recognize it's a value for a community of faith, you can begin to ask older adults, how many young people's names do you know? Is that more than you knew last year or fewer than you knew last year? You can ask them, you know, how much time, if you drew me a pie chart for how much time you spend at church, what percentage, how much of the pie do you spend talking to young people? You could ask, so you could begin to get at some of these metrics in a sense, these visuals that will help people reflect on their experience as the mentor. Or a young person, you could ask, if you got in trouble at school, are there grown-ups here at church that you would feel comfortable coming to talk to or finding to talk to?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Or do you have any adults, if they have a cell phone, do you have any phone numbers for adults from this church that aren't your parents? Like, could you text them if you needed to in an emergency? Or do you ever call them if they make phone calls ever anymore? But there's lots of tools to sort of get at the natural mentoring, but you've got to know your people really well. And you've got to know what it is you want to understand, what you're trying to strengthen by the assessment. On the formal side, and I think we can say this a little bit later, it is easier because you can say, you know, we have a 6-month or a 2-year mentoring program, and we know when it starts and when it ends. We know who we've recruited to participate in it. And there are ways in which we can set out some goals, and we can say, were they accomplished? And they can be both concrete goals, and they can also be experiential goals in terms of what people's understanding of their learning changes have been over time. Does that help, Kate, a little bit?
It does. It's easier to measure something that has more structure.
Right, but it's also important that we stop and reflect, right? This is experiential learning at its best. We have to stop and reflect on anything that we think we're doing that has value in forming faith. And those of us in faith formation leadership are historically bad at that. You know, we throw out all these great ideas. We run ourselves into the ground running programs and supporting people and caring and hoping it's taking. And we don't really know, you know, except sort of a quick survey at the end of a youth retreat, which mostly tells us that the food was bad. You know, we don't know sometimes how to do good assessment. And it's a whole science, but there are really good tools. And they can be written, they can be oral, they can be, you know, quick Post-it note exercises. They can be processes online where you just get people to start, you know, entering some reflections on a Facebook group. There's just a lot of good ways to catch people's reflection and learn.
To have to be agreed upon up front, it sounds like.
That's ideal, yeah. So quickly, the other ones you can read here, the degree to which participation is voluntary. So when people obviously opt into something, they are more inclined to participate in it more fully. When they're obligated, They are less inclined to be open to something. The time frame, how long a mentoring program lasts, how long the mentoring relationship can endure, matters a lot. There's lots of research about the mentoring programs for youth development and the benefits of the more sustained relationships, because a lot of the young people who are invited to be in those mentoring relationships in youth work are young people whose lives are vulnerable. They live on the margins of a stable society, and they do not need yet more change. They need to be able to trust and learn to depend on that person who's now been come into their life as an appointed mentor. So someone who makes a promise and doesn't keep it is not a helpful agent of that development. So the nature of the evaluation, this is what we just talked about, Kate. So more evaluation tends to happen on the formal side than the natural side, which is a good thing, because if you started like picking at everybody's everyday way of being, the sort of taken for grantedness of our ethos in community, we would start to feel very self-conscious and it wouldn't feel natural anymore. And then the other thing that distinguishes them is the ecology of the setting. So that means the sort of what are the boundaries of the space or the setting or the organization within which the mentoring is occurring. So if we can go to the next slide, this is just a reminder that there's a lot of literature that talks about the importance of mentoring as a model, that the person who is the mentor is a model of being human, of being adult for young people in this case. So there's research that shows very strongly that people's learned spiritual behaviors, such as compassion, forgiveness, devotion even, come from seeing those behaviors modeled by family and these significant adult members in their community, as well as through oral and written traditions and electronic media, actually. Much more so, though, than being just taught about them. So watching us, I used to have a poster on my wall that was from the Children's Defense Fund, and it was this beautiful little boy peeping around a door into someone's office, and that all it said on the poster was, live your life as if someone is watching, because somebody is. And I think of that as sort of my mantra as a mentor in the world, that even when I don't know I'm mentoring, I want to believe that I'm living an example of Christian witness that is hopeful for people who might be looking for that in their life. So then when we formalize that in intentional ways, we start to be attentive to what it means to be a model. So a quote here I have is that central to spiritual modeling phenomena is what we term observational spiritual learning. That is the learning of spiritually relevant skills or behaviors through observing other persons. Spirituality is difficult, if not possible, to teach in the abstract, which is why it is so critical for us to have these embodied and fleshed relationships of mentoring in times like youth confirmation preparation, because it's a place where kids can test the theory, right? Does this stuff really matter? Like, does this God stuff really matter? Is it really going to make my life better? Like, is it better than magic? What's it going to do? And it's only through other people's sort of incarnate experience, their witness to that in their lives, that kids can begin to trust that and see it, that it has sturdiness and value over time. So let's keep going. I want to get you guys talking. I don't want to talk at you too much. So the next slide is that Parker Palmer reminds us, and this is really important in spiritual mentoring, I think especially, that mentoring needs to be mutually beneficial. This quote says that mentors and apprentices are partners in an ancient human dance. And one of teaching's great rewards is the daily chance it gives us to get back on the dance floor. It is the dance of the spiraling generations in which the old empower the young with their experience, and the young empower the old with new life, reweaving the fabric of the human community as they touch and turn. So we know, those of us church leader types, that this is how every congregation should be, right? This is what we believe about the people of God in community. Unfortunately, it's not what most people experience. And so bringing an intentional mentoring dimension back into the lives of young people is incredibly, incredibly important and valuable. The benefits to mentors' own development makes mentoring not a chore and not just one more volunteer opportunity that they get roped into at church if we do it right, but it's a way to live into their own baptismal call, and it's a way for them to joyfully engage in their own sort of necessary reciprocity of loving others. Remember back to that Luke passage, loving one's neighbor as oneself. It's a way for them to actually enact that, to do it, to be it. And so without the love of neighbor, there cannot be a love of self. And without the love of self, there can be no love of the neighbor. With both of those kinds of love pointing ultimately to God. So one of the reasons I think offering mentoring as an opportunity, a ministry, a mutual ministry for the adult mentors and the young people in confirmation programs, is that we can get a glimpse of what it means to truly point our mutual lives back to God. And to me, that's really, really important. The world, as we know, watch the election, is not a place of profound hope today. And so when we have relationships that truly act out of love across generations, we can begin to believe that together we can, in fact, bring about the reign of God. And that indeed is, I think, the call on the church. So in confirmation, these intergenerational mentoring relationships create the space for both of these kinds of love, right? They create this opportunity for us to have the power to transform the lives of both the young person and the adult. So this is where I want you to get involved. So in your room, there should be some copies of two descriptions of confirmation leaders, confirmation mentoring programs in two different churches.
Actually, everybody has one, but they can be used to.
Okay, great. So let's look at the one that says Youth Confirmation 2016, the role of the mentor. Since we're going to kind of look at these and critique them a little bit, I chose two Episcopal churches, just to be fair to my, take it on my denomination. None of those Presbyterians are in here, you're safe. But I want to just glance at these. I'll let you read through the first one, the role of the mentor. And what I'd like to ask you is, what do you notice about that description, given what I've said, what you read in Sellner? What strikes you as significant about what is strong and helpful? Both of these are very intentional programs, but I would love to know what you think about that first one, the role of the mentor.
So what I notice is that it's very formal. It's not a natural mentor.
Right. So it's formalizing something, right? It's putting a structure around it. Exactly. Do you notice at the beginning that there's this sort of conflation of the social scientific research about mentoring and church, right? So it says, where studies show that young people who have an adult at church who knows them and cares about them are much more likely to remain involved in church as they grow up. And that's absolutely true. There's a lot more to it than that, right? It's not just an adult who knows them, but that's a good start. They're sort of saying there's research out there to say this stuff matters. What else do you notice? Would it help you if I tell you that, see number 1 where it says the mentor is asked to do the following? Would it help if I tell you that it says they're supposed to have these two conversations between February and Confirmation Sunday, which I looked up their Confirmation Sunday, that was in May. So there are two 30 to 45 minute conversations between February and May is the extent of their expectation. I don't know about you, but if I were a teenager and some random adult in the church suddenly wanted to sit down and talk to me for 30 to 45 minutes a couple of times in that window of time, I might be interested maybe in who the person is, maybe if the person's really cool or has a story to tell. I don't see myself being drawn to trust that as a lasting, sturdy relationship. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, they say realistically, the first conversation should be specifically about getting to know each other. Well, I mean, I'm an extrovert, and it takes me more than 45 minutes to get to know people well enough to feel like I can trust them with my deeper concerns or questions. So I feel as if this is one of those examples that is trying to do the right thing, for sure, but it is playing into the apologetic posture of we don't want to bother the adults too much, right? We don't want to demand too much of them so they might say no. It's preferencing the idea that kids will at least meet an adult, which is a good thing. But it feels to me like it's favoring the adult needs over the young person's developmental needs. I've not been there. I don't know how this actually played out. I don't know anything more than what I found on the internet looking for descriptions of mentor roles. But I can see myself offering something like this in one of the churches I used to work in, because everybody wants a mentoring program. And I think some of the programs that we surveyed have this kind of a model. They can say, yes, that's a part of the requirement of our confirmation program. But when you start to look down inside it and say, well, what's really happening there? A lot of it is optional. There's sort of a wishful thinking here that this adult will find it valuable and then will choose to attend some of these additional services with the young people. Will come along with their confirmand to the Holy Week services. Will attend the rehearsal dinner. They are asked to do that because in our tradition, the bishops confirm. So there's often a rehearsal, and it's something the day before the bishop will come to the parish to confirm, and then attend the service. But again, there'll be a lot of other people at those events. The family members will be there. The other confirmands will be there. The young people are often encouraged to invite their friends from school to be at those events. So my concern would be if I were the adult trying my hardest to be a good mentor, and I'd only had these 2 45-minute conversations, I could feel kind of dissed by my confirmand, who is like hanging out where he or she wants to hang out with their friends, right? Because those are just formal. And then I'm just sitting there in some long event that I'm not that excited about because I only have the connection through this confirmand. So do you see the vulnerability in trying to do this and trying to formalize it? But if we're not careful, it can risk being careful, intentional, but not substantive. Let's look at the other one. It's longer, and I don't want to make you just sort of have to sit and read too much, but
feel free to talk so she knows you're here with her.
What was that?
So feel free to talk so she knows you're here in the room with her.
Oh, okay. Yeah, anybody, talk to me. But this is another Episcopal church. I think it's probably a much larger church, but they do a little defining, right, in their confirmation mentoring guidelines here at St. David's. They say, what is a mentor? And they talk about it's an adult Christian who is a spiritual friend and advisor. They want a mature Christian. Now, for some adults, that could be alienating right there. You're not going to get me because I don't know that I'm a mature Christian. What is mature? But maybe that opens the door for a conversation. If someone asks me to be a mentor, they must see something in me that I didn't know. A mentor models the living of the Christian life for the confirmand. So do you notice that here, they're very clear that they're wanting people who will nurture Christian discipleship. That language is pretty absent in the other job description that I shared with you. This one, they've got a pretty high bar, right? They want this person to be someone the young person can bring questions to about faith, and someone that they can trust to walk with them in this process of forming their own faith and their own trust in God as they renew their baptismal vows. So then what is a confirmand? A little teaching here. What is confirmation? A little explanation here. And in our tradition in particular, in the Episcopal Church, and this is a lot of our research has been about this too. So what do we really mean by confirmation? So they take a stand. They say, this is what we believe confirmation is, and that's great. Then they say they've got this broken down, I think, kind of nicely into what are the mentor basics. I find it lovely that the very first thing they list is praying for your confirmand. That already suggests that there is a broader time frame and a broader ecology for this relationship than just the time you would be one-to-one doing something or talking. And you can read those other bullets yourselves, but they illustrate well a more holistic experience of mentor relationship. And they also kind of feed into the sense of what this mature adult's life witness looks like for the young person. The expectation that he or she will share their journey, their spiritual journey with their young person. They give the mentors some background on what the kids are learning in their confirmation class. They list all the clergy and people that are involved in helping to teach this class, which also to me, as an outsider looking in, says this church really believes that confirmation matters. That's a lot of clergy time to put into a confirmation program. It's not just one person doing this in one classroom somewhere at the back end of the education building. This looks like the whole team is engaged, which I think is an impressive statement to the congregation, speaking of the ecology. So then it says, how often would you meet? They're asking for one-on-one mentoring at least once a month for that full year, that school year. And then they go on and they give them the calendar of events. And if you look here, there's a variety of social events as well as church worship events. It sort of frames the chances that these mentors will have to interact with their mentees at the gathered events, as well as in their one-on-one experiences. And then it talks a little bit about a curriculum that they're offering to people and what they can use to actually engage in this relationship with their mentee. So what should I cover? And it gives them some ideas about how to do that. What are the best ways to get started? It gives them some tools. I assume that they do some talking about this. They don't just give them a piece of paper. But I like where they're going. I like that they are giving people natural on-ramps for conversation with a teenager that are more realistic. Talking about confirmation immediately may not be the thing that will get the two of them really into a kind of informal, natural form of community conversation. But then it lists some other activities, some things, and these are not surprising if you know anything about mentoring, but it gives them tangible ideas. If someone is an adult who's been asked to be a mentor but has never done this before, this gives them a chance to think about how might they actually, spend the time together. What could they do? But at the end, they say, have fun. And may God bless your efforts to initiate and develop a relationship with your confirmand. That has a more comprehensive understanding, I think, than the first description. And yet it's very formal, right? There's a start and an end. Any questions before we just wrap this up? I've got a few more slides to share and then we'll get this done.
I would just say, I love this, but I can see too how the appeal for making it easier for adults happens as you're scrambling to get enough to cover all of the students. And just realizing how much of it is also a culture of the church long before you're asking for these mentors of, the youth,
right?
People being important, and just wondering if you can speak to
that. That's a really good point. I would say, I hope, one of your ministerial practices is that you help a congregation build on its strengths. So I think no two congregations should do any of this the same. We should all build on the strengths God has given us, the gifts that are present there. I think the answer for me about the reality of people's lives and busyness is that first example, I would actually rather not even attempt to call that a mentoring program. And I would much rather put the energy into some intergenerational gatherings at the church or at a local park, depending on who the congregation is. What do they do organically that they could do a little more of that would bring an invited group of good adults together with the confirmands? Mm-hmm. Could they go to the zoo together? Could they go to an art gallery together and go out for ice cream and talk about religious art? What could they do? Could they build a Habitat for Humanity house together? I would say that you would be better using the limited time adults have in a meaningful way to do something together with young people that is mutually enjoyable and mutually valuable, and build into that some time for reflection. So some chances to huddle in small groups or do some paired conversation and just give them some really good question prompts. I think that will stimulate more sustained potential for relationship and curiosity about each other's lives than something as lean and as rigid as that one sounds, as if it is.
Can I just jump in and add something that I saw that I thought was a really amazing thing that a lot of the churches were doing that not a lot, but some of them were doing that we read about or that we learned through our research about was they would have the youth pick someone to be their mentor. And I don't know if you want to talk about that dynamic at all, but I thought that I just was really captivated by this.
Actually, Brian, can you go forward with the slides? Because I think we can just race ahead to some best practices, because that includes this thing. So this question about recruitment. It is really important that we think about who we ask. And I'm assuming we're taking again for granted that there are expectations of our denominations and our church structures about safe church and background checks and so forth when adults work with young people. Assuming those can be met in whatever way. In addition to that, it is important to find people that young people will naturally be able to relate to about something that they share in common. So yes, a lot of churches invite young people to identify the adults. Sometimes I used to say to my kids in my confirmation program, like, who are the grown-ups in the coffee hour that you want to hang out with? Like, who are the ones who actually talk to you? And who are the people that you enjoy, when they ask you a question, you actually want to answer it? And they can give you a pretty honest list. And then you can go through that list and you kind of know these people, and you can go through this list and say, sort of filter it for the people who are too busy, would not be mature and appropriate in whatever ways you might know privately. But then if that list becomes people that the kids have chosen, when the young people go to those adults themselves and say, we'd really like you to be our mentor or a mentor or my mentor, the adults have a very hard time saying no. And right alongside of that is you need to be really clear about what the level of commitment is, which is why that model of St. David's is helpful, some kind of roadmap that says, we know what we're asking you to jump into. It's not a terminal, it's not a life sentence. It's something that we're saying for now. We also encourage kids to find their godparents. And with social media now and all sorts of online platforms, their godparents, even if they're not geographically local, can be great mentors for confirmation programs. They can do a hangout. They can do any number of other ways of connecting, FaceTime or Zooming in with each other. They can talk to and begin to reconnect with godparents that they might have lost touch with. And that again gets back to that mutuality. It helps the adult rekindle his or her understanding of faith and spirituality and reduce the guilt of having lost touch with their godchild. So recruitment does matter, but I think what I would say you should never do, and I see all the time, is don't put something in your newsletter or in your e-news or in your bulletin that says, hey, we need mentors, looking for volunteers, because as many of you know, you'll probably get some of the wrong people. And then you end up in a very difficult pastoral situation where they volunteered and you have to turn them down. So you don't want to put out a general call. You definitely want to keep the inviting to a process that is discerning. And I would pray about the people you ultimately ask. So there's a few more best practices just to kind of highlight them. Brian, if you can just kind of keep going through these. These are quotes that are just saying why it's important. So the parent said, there's always something more to learn, more Bible, more whatever. This is just ways that suggest why it's so important for us to have mentors that are not just the same people all the time. The one youth leader on the top says, know that you, the mentor, don't have to be cool. What you need to be is authentic. And she goes on to just describe that it's really important to just be real. And that's what the kids are looking for. You can be the geekiest, most boring, seeming older adult, and kids find you fascinating. What you can't be is fake, and they will see right through you. So then the next slide is another one is screening. This is the piece about the background checks and being sure that people are healthy in their interaction with young people. And you may have guidelines about how they can meet with young people in a safe way. But that stuff matters. If you're going to formalize your mentoring program, you don't want to assume anything about what adults know about how to spend time with young people one-on-one. And then the next one is training. That sounds very formal, but these best practices come from the National Mentoring Partnership, which is a mentoring program for young people that works in schools, in agencies, and supports church work also. Training may not be the right word, but orientation, preparation, getting to have a time for Q&A for people to know what they're getting into. A little bit of role playing, perhaps. It's awkward when you're an adult and the kid is sort of indifferent to you. How do you not lose your cool and feel totally like you're back in 7th grade yourself? All of those things are helpful to the adults. You want it to be successful because what you want the adults to do is you want them to be an example of someone who loves God and loves life, and that the young person feels drawn to that possibility.
I think there was a question on the survey for ministry leaders, at least for the confirmation project, about how many people receive training. And it was overwhelmingly, the answer was they received training only on the job.
That's right.
And so there was no external training, no continuing education. And we can guess with some accuracy probably why that is.
Right. I mean, that's exactly right, Kate. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I just was going to underscore, I think that not only is it important, but I think people actually want it.
Right. No, I think, and it's an opportunity for adult formation, right? I mean, which all of us who know anything about Christian formation know we have a kind of crisis of adult belief and faith. So these are chances to do sort of a little bit of an, just a little bit of an insertion of some really good content, little intervention in a positive way on behalf of the kids. The next one is matching and initiating. So once you decide you're going to do some kind of mentoring and you are intentional about it and you've prayed it into being, and you begin to recruit these good people and you orient them to what it can be, and the young people too, you need to prepare them for what to expect. A lot of kids are just like clueless. They're just told they're supposed to go meet with this mentor. They don't even know what that means. So how do we help them be successful and bring their best selves into it too? The matching is important. this could have happened because the kids chose the person, or it happens because you know two people are musicians, or you know they live in the same neighborhood and there's a great ice cream shop in that neighborhood. Some kind of intentional way that you can begin to orient the young people to their potential mentors is really important. And then giving them a chance to start together. Some of the best mentoring programs that I've seen have the mentors and the mentees meet for the first time at a gathered event that the church sponsors. And it's really fun. And it's a way for everybody to kind of be around each other with enough sort of great other things that they're not just stuck sitting awkwardly across a cup of coffee. And then they, before they leave, they're all asked to make their plan to get together the next time. So they kind of covenant together and then pray about their experience as mentors, and then come back at the end of their period of mentoring and celebrate in a similar way. So that's initiating and closing can be very related to each other. Monitoring and support, this is the next one that comes from this traditional world of partnership. And it's just that you don't just launch mentoring and then walk away. You need to check in with people. You need to have a way that you're checking in with the mentors. You need to check in with the kids. The relationships that just aren't jiving, that aren't working well, what can be done to support them? Is it something that a little nudge, a little suggestion will improve the situation? Or is it just really two people who are oil and water and it's simply not going to work? And that's okay. Then it's your role as the leader to find a graceful and appropriate way to terminate that relationship, not as a failure, but in recognizing that, you know, we don't all necessarily organically get along with each other in the same way. Doesn't mean either person is wrong or bad, but those kinds of comforting and assuring leadership practices help the mentors in a mentoring program engage much more confidently and much more fully. And then finally, closure. Don't let your mentoring that you've worked on getting set up, don't let it just drift off into nothingness. Make sure there is a way that it ends if it's a formal mentoring part of your confirmation program. How does it end? How do you thank the mentors? How do you celebrate that they accomplished what they accomplished? How do you ask both people, both parties, what they experienced from it? How do you do that assessment, right? How do you begin to say, what difference did your relationship with Mrs. Jones make? You know, what did you learn about life and about her and about being together? Do we need to stop right at 3? Or am I at that point? I see it's 3 o'clock.
What do you think? Do we have a couple of minutes?
Yeah. Well, it's always a stance between wanting to go on and giving what comes next another time. I would like to make sure people have a chance to interact.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I would love too. So let's stop. Let's drop the slides. There are a couple of fun ideas. One person does something called Grand Friends. They get much older people in the congregation, retired, and they make them the mentors, basically, which is often not, people think everyone has to be cool and 30-something, they're 20, 30-something to be a mentor. Not at all. And then this other one is anonymous. It's a program where the mentors actually write to their mentees, and they have a letter of like a pen pal relationship, and they don't reveal them like Secret Santas. They don't reveal them until the very end. And that creates an anonymity and a freedom to be honest and kind of be more forthcoming that they've discovered has been really valuable. So, okay, let's just leave it there. And I will take any questions, comments. How do you all feel mentoring could be useful to you, or can it be? Or
Can it?
Yeah, thank you very much for the insight. What kept coming into my mind as you are presenting was about if there is an overlap between formal mentoring and natural mentoring, are there possibilities of naturalizing a formal mentorship program, or on the other hand, formalizing a natural mentorship? And in addition, how does that impact on, maybe we mentioned mentorship is also dependent on the mutuality, reciprocity, and friendship, and all these. So most of them cannot be bound by time, because the young people want to take it over even beyond the confirmation period. What would be the reaction to that?
I think you're asking a brilliant question about cultural context, and this whole distinction between formal mentoring and natural mentoring is very much a Western North American framework because of our the dissipating, the absence of our kinship structures being sturdy enough for the natural mentoring to always be in place. We have so much urbanization and people so segregated and separated from their natural support structures. So formal mentoring has, particularly in youth development, was brought in to to supplement what the household and the extended family and the churches were not able to do. In my perfect world, in God's perfect world, I would imagine, maybe too, we would be working on celebrating the natural mentoring that is lifelong, that can also become much more mutual and much less age divided. As you all know, in the digital age, the expertise can be in people much younger than us. I have been mentored many times by younger people on how to use certain devices or software. And we need to find a way that we celebrate and build up those natural relationships that are forming. So some of that is about time. How do we create time to honor the informal relationships? How do we spend enough time together so that church is not just activities that are already structured, but there's some relaxed time? And how do we name the sacred relationships that we see forming and give honor to them and give thanks to God for them? So I would say in many settings, there is no need for formal mentoring, except perhaps in leadership formation, where we really begin to say, someone is trying to learn particular things for particular roles. But we need to be much more deliberate about, as you said, naturalizing the formal so that it is more lasting.
Lisa, do you have any concrete pictures in mind of congregations where you have a kind of spiritual companioning that's an important part of the congregational culture as a whole? And it seems like in those settings where people have friendships, spiritual friendships with one another, with peers or in small groups, or you can think of all, where they have spiritual direction relationships. I mean, you can think of all the ways that can be
That's right.
part of the culture of the congregation. Seems like those kinds of communities have more of an opportunity to have natural
Right.
mentoring relationships, or at least people with a readiness to do that.
That's right.
Of what that looks like. Do you have any kind of sense on about concrete pictures of that?
I'm sorry, that last sentence I lost.
Well, I just sort of wanted to know, do you have any pictures of congregations, do you know of congregations that you think embody that? A cultural, spiritual friendship that would make the possibility of these kinds of natural mentoring relationships more, in fact, natural.
I wish I could give you a long list, but I do know some churches. Again, it's that building on strengths and building on the culture of the congregation as a place that values the spiritual formation of all people. The baptismal covenant and the commitment to lifelong formation has done a lot to move, at least the Episcopal Church, and I think other traditions, into a much more conscious awareness that our spiritual journey is not something that starts and stops. It's something that we continue for the whole journey. So I have seen it in places where young people are invited into, like I know one church that invites young people to get into spiritual direction if they want to, and they have some trained directors who work with young people. I think places where there's story-based cultures, where narrative is the priority, where people sit and talk story and tell their stories, and this is where cultures other than a number of dominant European American cultures have an advantage, where people are able to share what they know, what they believe about God and their prayer life, and pray freely and witness to their faith in just that spontaneous and organic way. Those congregations, particularly Latino congregations, they are doing a natural job of raising children and young people in a culture that is unafraid of God and believes God is at the center of everyday life. I think that can then be harnessed, and they can do even more to invite young people to then talk about their own personal faith narratives and to seek out people who can best respond to a particular question a young person has. If they're asking about comparative religion or something, who's the person in the congregation that they know that they could go and talk? So it's basically helping young people, or anyone of any age, develop an individual education plan in the life of the spirituality of a congregation. But you're absolutely right. We need to cultivate that culture in our churches. And in my mind, be very careful with what we call mentoring, because I think we need to mentor on the natural side better than we are. And then when we do formal mentoring, we need to be sure, as the one student asked, how do they graduate out of formal mentoring into something that is more sustainable and more natural? So the congregation has to be brought along so that it's not programmatic only. It's a program that serves the identity of the congregation as a whole. I'm very aware of your time, and I can sit here for another hour, but I know that you have other things you need to be doing. So I'm delighted to take more questions or whatever you need.
Any other questions?
I would love to know from the students, did you enjoy reading this book? Did you find Sellner valuable and relatable to your ministry practice in other areas?
Yes.
Because it's...
In terms of position people, placing young people with other families, do we need to do a psychoanalysis of the congregation so the kids can be well positioned, not only for the kids' positioning, but for the family positioning?
It's a really good question. I don't know if I would say psychoanalysis. I think a mapping of your congregation, for sure, of where the healthy families, units, individuals, formation hubs are. I often, with congregations, when they want to talk about how they do Christian formation for any age or all ages, I'll have them map the life of their congregation. And they always want to tell me about the classes they teach. And I say, no, where do you gather? Where are the warm places in your building? Where do people sit and have coffee? Where do stories get told? Where do people sing? Where is the spirit alive in your building and in the ministries beyond your building? Those are the places that you're forming faith. So how do we bring young people into relationship in their confirmation preparation with those hubs of formation that are already going on that don't look a whole lot like classes very often? They often are, some group of people that are just passionate about their thing. What does it look like for kids to jump into the middle of that and join up with them and do that for a while? Whatever their thing is, if it's an outreach project or if it's a craft project. But I think those places where the Spirit is moving are where we need to be bringing young people into relationship with adults.
Final question.
Do you feel that the hip grandmother are not well utilized in the church? Because we have a generation that are getting older. Are they well utilized for the mentoring or for the confirmation process to help the youth?
Was the question about grandmothers or God?
They have a lot of grandmothers in the church.
Yeah.
They're very well knowledgeable. They can use the internet. They can sit at Starbucks. Do we use them? Do you see a need for them to be well utilized?
Oh, we must use them. That's the one little last idea, that grand friends idea that I was proposing. I mean, you all know this as well as anyone, that people are living across the globe. People are living longer than we've ever lived. The fastest growing age demographic is 85 plus. And the women and men who are living into their 80s and 90s have faith to share, and they have time to share it. So yes, this is this untapped resource for formation in the church. And most of our young people, and I think this crosses cultures in many cases, most of our young people don't live near or know many people in their own family above a certain age. So any chance that they get to really be nurtured by and respectful of the elders in their extended church family are very important, and mutually so important, as Eric Erickson and others talk about generativity, for people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s to feel that they are contributing back and making a lasting difference in the world, that they are actually contributing to a life well lived as they are preparing for the end of their life. Mutually, you can't do it better.
Well, Lisa, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your visit. She's absolutely one of my favorite colleagues in this confirmation project that we've been a part of. And you kind of get a sense of the range of giftedness that she brings, from being able to do hardcore social science to talking about spiritual companioning. And I mean, it's just, that's great about being in practical theology, is you get to bring all that stuff together. So Lisa, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, and I apologize for talking at you so much, but I wasn't quite sure how to get started. And so anyway, I would be happy to take email questions, and feel free to share my email address. I'm more than happy to keep this conversation going in any way that is useful to you all. So
Thank you.
Thanks.
thank you.